Changing schools and mobility. Families may move often because of, for economic reasons, economic instability. And of course, we know when we have these students what the impact is when they miss school, when they change programs, they can change to a different educational approach. All these things have an impact. Another big issue, at least in the Northeast, we had many students who would have extended absences when they went to their home country. Because the majority of the deaf and hard of hearing students in the Northeast are Puerto Rican, that's because there's a huge, a high percentage of hereditary deafness on Puerto Rico. It hasn't been studied, but in Boston, most of our kids had family members that were deaf. We got later generations from the same family in the school. Often when I meet a person who's Puerto Rican, I ask them, is there anyone deaf in your family? And 50% of the time they'll tell me yes, so that's very, very unusual. Of course, think about an island. When you have a genetic pool on an island, it's going to kind of expand the number of people with that genetic characteristic of deafness. So we would have many students, and this was even a bigger issue in New York, like at the Lexington School, where the kids would go home for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. We had children, the families would move back to Puerto Rico, and despite the extraordinarily high number of deaf children, there are very few schools for the deaf. There's one Catholic school, there's one tiny missionary school, and there's a school on the south of the island that keeps kind of appearing and disappearing, so services are very spotty. And they are under IDEA and US education law, but it still doesn't make a difference. Home communication. This was my dissertation. This is something that, a topic that is very close to my heart, partly because I grew up with a deaf brother, which I didn't really think about till my advisor said, well, duh, the reason you're doing this topic is because you understand it. I'm like, oh, I never thought of that. So my number one reminder is never assume there's no communication at home. Until you've spent time with that family, you don't know what they do. Many students use gestures, foreign signs, etc. at home. I had a student, a 5-year-old boy in my study whose family was Puerto Rican. His mother had deaf members in the family. At home, he code switched between ASL and Puerto Rican Sign Language, and he was 5 years old. And the mother said to me, well, they told me at school I signed wrong. And here was this 5-year-old who was managing the variations. For example, at home, at school, you know, cracker. This is a 5-year-old, you have snack time, cracker. But at home, he signed this. This. Why? Because there's a brand of crackers, very popular in Puerto Rico, that comes in a big can, has faces on the can, and there's a man with a mustache. So I'm not sure if it was a home sign or a Puerto Rican sign. There were other signs he used that I was able to verify later were Puerto Rican signs, such as his sign for birthday, which was this. Fascinating. So here you have a 5-year-old who's able to do this kind of managing and code switching and saying, well, mom signs this or this, and that's what I do at home. And the student may know some of the home language, especially if the student's hard of hearing or they've gone to school in their home country. And hard of hearing students often speak the home language to varying degrees. And this is just a reminder that the environment is trilingual. It doesn't mean everyone in the environment is trilingual, but the family is managing 3 languages. And it may even be multilingual if you have another sign language. So you would have English, I keep using Spanish as an example. I'll just stick with that. English, Spanish, American Sign Language, or American Sign, and then whatever signs that they use from their home country. So it's trilingual regardless. Sometimes they know the sign language of their home country, so then what do? Well, networking, we may be able to determine something about what they know. International students at Gallaudet, you're not all close to Gallaudet, but if you are, there are international students who know those sign languages. And if you're dealing with, for example, Mexican Sign Language, some of the trilingual interpreters through the national organization of those interpreters know Mexican Sign Language or other sign languages. Or sometimes you can find other deaf adults in the community. So it's a matter of reaching out and being creative, not just assuming that they don't know. Bridging languages is something that goes on at home. One of the things I observed in multiple families was that someone in the family serves as an interpreter for the deaf and hard of hearing child. Sometimes it's the mom, sometimes it's a sibling. And the student, if hard of hearing students especially, may take on the role of interpreting for their parents, and this can happen at school, it can happen in the community. We don't often recognize that translating is a higher cognitive function. I've seen a high school student from Puerto Rico. This was not in Boston, in another school. And the student was translating from the mother's spoken Spanish, the student was profoundly deaf, to ASL for the teachers. I just observed. And then when we went into the IEP meeting, the student, you start out with strengths and weaknesses. His language abilities weren't even referred to. There was a long list of weaknesses. And so I interrupted and I said, you know, an hour ago, the student was the only competent person in the room. He was able to translate for his mom. And now you're just listing all the things that he can't do. I'll add that they tried to kick me out of the IEP meeting. But the parents said they would leave if I left. I was there only as an advocate. Assessment. One of the things you can consider on intake, if you have a student who is underschooled and you really don't know where to start, you can consider doing a short-term IEP and formative assessment to gauge the student's current levels of understanding. And then you write a long-term IEP after a period of whatever it is that you're permitted. It might be 30 days, it may be 6 weeks, 2 months. And another option is dynamic assessment. And I will describe that on the next page, but this has been used at Lexington School for many years. One of their psychologists set up this program. Lexington School in New York City has many immigrant students, many. It's New York. You're talking, you know, from all over, from Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, Africa, Latin America. Israel uses this with immigrant students because the psychologist who came up with this method was Israeli, and ASHA also has references on dynamic assessment. And I have a little bit more of a description here, which is, it's simply you pre-test to find out what the student can do now. Then you teach to help develop specific strategies, and you observe how the student learns that, how quickly, what concepts are there, what concepts might be missing. You figure out how to plug in those gaps, and then you post-test, and you assess how much they're learning these strategies. And again, there's a link here. ASHA has a basic framework, but as I said, this has been used at Lexington School for the Deaf in New York for quite a long time. No Child Left Behind poses challenges for all of us. There's a project, Anne mentioned that I've been involved with this group as a sort of advisor on deaf and hard of hearing students. And it involves 5 states at this point. So it's really attempting to address how to assess English learners with disabilities under No Child Left Behind. And there's reports and recommendations online, which the link will be available to you. Now, talking about the school environment, the first group I look at is the parents. What happens when the parents walk into school? What happens when parents walk into your school? I once told the secretary that a priest was coming to see me. He was from Spain and he was deaf. Well, he showed up, but he wasn't wearing his collar. And the secretary just kind of fell apart. She didn't know, who's this man? And luckily we had a full-time parent liaison who was Spanish speaking, and she got him, and she figured out, oh, this is the priest that was visiting me. But then she kind of got upset that he wasn't wearing his collar, like he was out of uniform, and that wasn't fair. So the key is that the staff should have some idea, some plan what to do when a parent shows up. You don't want them kind of falling apart because someone appears that they can't communicate with. You want the parents to feel at home, and you don't want them to give this message their language is a problem right away. And then some schools post signs in other languages. Well, that can be misleading if there's no one there in the school who speaks that language. I've heard that from parents. You know, schools send out all this information in Spanish or Vietnamese, and then I go to school and there's no one there that can help me. So it's kind of misleading. Just something to keep in mind. And then I'm sure you're probably familiar that IDEA requires language access. Even if it's not written, it can be provided orally when you're talking about the IEP. If you have parents from a culture such as many Hmong people don't write their language, it's more of an oral language. So you can have someone explain the IEP to them. And then also consider access at other activities. If you have enough parents from one language community, you could have a parent liaison who speaks that language. This was one of the things that the projects in New York and the Northeast back in the 70s advised. And they worked with schools to set up these kind of roles. And students should see themselves in the school. Even if it's a map or a picture. I remember one time, and these were graduate students, I had a student from New Zealand. I knew he was from New Zealand in the first class, I don't know. I must have put up some maps, and I showed a map of New Zealand, and he went he was ecstatic. It's like, oh my God, that's my country. And this is an adult. So it means something. Now, when we talk about curriculum, I'm running out of time. What are we doing? How are our students reflected? Do we add to the curriculum? Is it only special events? Do we change the curriculum? Do we work for change? We have to know about our students. All of us should know what are the languages at home, who lives with them. work together to learn about their cultures and languages. If there's community events, we can go. I live near a very large Cambodian temple, and they had a festival. I went with my son because he had to do a school project. And people were very welcoming. You know, it's obvious you're not, I mean, it was obvious when we showed up we weren't Cambodian, but it was still, and it's in our neighborhood. And there are a lot of, there's a large Cambodian population in Northern Virginia and Maryland. Some of the things we can do right away is a needs assessment in our own school. What's a short-term thing that we could do right away? What's a long-term need? Identify resources in the community. Are there other service providers in general ed, people that are speakers of other languages that can support the needs of these students and their families? You can have a study group in your school. One of the best books that I've ever read on cultural clash is The Spirit Catches You When You Fall Down, and it's about the clash between the medical system and a Hmong family. That's H-M-O-N-G, Hmong, and a child with special needs.